And welcome to the audience. So the topic I'm talking about today is, in fact, not only SAP security. I've titled my talk Beyond SAP Security and SAP GRC, reflecting the changing business workloads. So defining strategies on governance, risk management, compliance, security, and identity beyond the SAP silo. And I think this is the point I really touch on, this last aspect, because what we observe is that the workloads are changing. And so for the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to cover a number of aspects in this area. And I'd like to start with, you're not alone. And I think when we look at what happened over the last more than 20 years right now, but what definitely speeded up over the last few years is that business workloads have been changing. The way we deliver business applications, we deliver business workloads really has changed beyond SAP ERP, so the traditional sort of SAP landscape. And this is happening for SAP itself. If you look at SuccessFactors, Ariba, and for others, so Salesforce is out there for quite a while. And that means when we look at this entire topic, it means the world of business workloads is becoming more heterogeneous. And we need to think about how do we best deal with this changing world. And this is an interesting sort of challenge of balance between, and that's what I touch later, between the depths we need in these environments and the breadth, so the sort of the complexity, the increasing heterogeneity we are facing. And overall, we see that there are a couple of trends which affect the entire scape or landscape of what we do around SAP security and access control. And one of these trends is that there's always the question of value. It is always harder to sell, even internally, that we want to, or that we need a security solution, a technical access control solution. So if we can prove that there's more, that we can do more than checkbox compliance, that we can provide insight into how business processes are working, that we can provide more positive value, then we are clearly on the better side of the story. We can have better arguments for the investments in the technology we need. So we must think about what we can do. And I think aside of the business value, I've never been a believer in checkbox compliance, because at the end it's about being really secure, being sort of ahead of the auditor, not always trailing the auditor. The second aspect I already touched to some extent is this changing systems landscape, and it gets even broader when we look at, for instance, the enterprise service management strategies a lot of organizations are following these days. That means we have even more here. We have an even bigger complexity, more vendors, and critical business information resides in many places today. The other aspect is we need to, and this is I think an ongoing challenge we have, we need to do it well with the business teams. So we all know that business people don't really like to deal with whatever T-codes and stuff like that. And so we need to do it in a manner which is sort of deep enough, but also usable enough. And so things are changing here. And at the end, we also need to deploy it also in the context of this changing landscape. So when organizations are moving to S/4HANA, when organizations are adding other types of business applications that run as a SaaS service, then we need to be ready with all we have in access control and security to support this changing environment. We can't be the showstopper or the one who delays the business initiatives. We must be ready, and that also requires that the way we run such services, whichever they are, is adequate to the requirements of the business. And one thing is very clear, we will always need tools. So we can't solve the challenges in securing business applications and implementing adequate governance for business applications without tools. We also need the tools to translate, to automate, and to reduce complexity. And this complexity thing is something we must not underestimate. When we look at what is happening in these environments, so the more heterogeneous they get, the more complex they become. So you have your user accounts and maybe roles and entitlements in system A, and some others in system B with a little bit different constructs, and then the system C might use other terms again and other concepts. And this complexity in a multi-system environment is extremely hard to manage. So we need the tools to reduce complexity, and this need is increasing when our world becomes more heterogeneous. And so this is, I think, super essential to understand and to react on, to build the environment we are using to protect all these systems, to keep that always in mind. And also, we must keep in mind that there are different perspectives. From a business perspective, from a technology perspective, there are things which are seen quite differently and are understood at different levels. So businesses understand the business activities, so the individual tasks. They understand how these tasks map into business process, or how they are part of business processes. That is what business people know. And at the end, this is also their perspective on who should do what. People know their tasks in the business, understand to which business process it counts. It already gets a little bit more complicated when we talk about business roles. So roles are, and I talked about this in a previous KC Live event some few weeks ago, which was more about access governance. Roles are an artifact, so they are artificial, and defining roles is always challenging. So here the problem in some way starts because we need to translate something the business is totally and sort of inherently aware of into some more abstract artifact. And so business roles, but still come from the business. And again, we all know that this is frequently a challenge, that the business doesn't work very closely sometimes with the IT on defining the roles, the various level of roles. And then we have the technical artifacts. So all these system controls, whatever they are. And again, I think another level of complexity we are facing is that when you have a more heterogeneous environment, these artifacts, the technical ones, are not always the same. So every vendor has its own ideas on how to manage security, how to manage access controls, how to manage all these artifacts in its own environment. Sometimes that even changes with major releases, or additional models are added. So when we look at some of these models, and that makes it really complex, and it makes it even more difficult to understand for business people. So when we had in the past this sort of homogeneous world of SAP R3, it was easier because everything was somewhat the same. It isn't anymore today. And then we also have the data, so we also need to understand what does it mean, not only from a functional perspective, so who can perform which function, which transaction, but also the data. At the end, it is always the data we want to protect. And this also makes it more complex to understand how we set up this entire environment. And we need the technology here. So a challenge clearly we have to solve with what we do in this space is that we need to map this business perspective and the technology perspective, as well as the artifacts on both ends. And so we have a business view which looks at the entire thing from a business perspective, and we have a technology view. And so we have the business artifacts like processes, business processes, and tasks or activities, and we have the technical aspects from the various systems. And what we need our tools to do to be successful is to help us in managing this complexity and in reducing that complexity. And one aspect here is that we need this translation. So translate the perspectives so that everyone sees what is really relevant to him or her. It is about mapping. So mapping these business artifacts and the business view to the technology view. And it's about automation and insight, because at the end, at the technical level, we have so many different artifacts like roles, like authorization objects, like entitlements. We can't manage them manually. We need something which helps us to automate, which helps us to identify where, for instance, are the biggest risks, which helps us in gaining the insight we need here. And that is, from my perspective, the reason why we need these tools and why we need adequate tools that are able to deliver this translation so that we have a unified view of the business across the entire environment, and not a view on this system and this system and this system. And on the other hand, that we have the depth of insight we need at the technical level. So what's the key to success? I believe the key to success in today's environments is understanding that we need a broader scope for modern GRC for business applications and beyond. And when you look at what many, probably most vendors are currently doing, is that they are expanding into this broader towards this broader scope. So when I look at some of the key requirements for successful GRC, so what must it provide today? Then the first one always is the business perspective. At the end, the tools must deliver to the business. They must provide the interface to the business. They must provide their information in the language of the business. They must deliver the translation. That also means there must be a modern UI that works for every user with dashboards, etc. Yes, you need the UIs which are very efficient for the tech-savvy users, for the ones who have to do a lot of work in that. But at the end of the day, it must be a good modern UI that is targeted at the various groups of users that are using the systems. So not everyone is spending all day with these systems. Not everyone is an auditor which runs audits every day or every second day or however. So we need to understand, and we must support that fact that most users only look occasionally into the systems. Part of this entire thing is, as I've said, the mapping. So terminology mapping in both directions, because business users don't want to understand tech terms, and they should not be obliged to learn tech terms, and vice versa. We need automation. With complex environments, with tons of data that we have around security, with very complex entitlement structures, when we go more towards the security events, with immense amounts of security events to handle, we need the automation which reduces the complexity and which analyzes where are the things we really need to put our emphasis on. But we also need to be able to drill into the detail. If there's a red flag, we need to go down into and to understand what is behind that red flag. So we need this part as well. I'm a strong believer we need a broad system support. That is clearly one of the interesting things to discuss. You also might come up with something which is a little bit layered, where you say, this is my cross-system perspective we have on top, and then we have the specialized systems for which help us to implement security and to do governance risk compliance for certain environments. Not necessarily the one tool which solves it all, but you need to understand at the end, you need to take a broader perspective, reflecting the changing reality of business applications, but also provide a deep insight into the various areas. Supporting the flexible operating models also is essential. The world is changing, and we see that a vendor just recently called it cloud first, multi-hybrid. So cloud first is the very common strategy, but at the end, we have a hybrid environment with different clouds we are using and with different types of deployment models from on-premises to public cloud. And we should be able to deal with these environments in a flexible manner. And as I said, last but not least, it goes even beyond the business systems. So think beyond that. Think GRC, identity management, think beyond the traditional GRC space. Think about how does this relate to identity and access management? We have a lot of sensitive data, and how can we map this? What is this enterprise service management with business process management, etc.? Cybersecurity when it comes to the security analytics part. There's more to integrate with. And what it needs, from my perspective, is we need a broader plan on this. So what we need is a breadth and integration across applications deployment models. So it's the connect part, the depth to analyze, and we need the ability to deliver these solutions. So I think it's a good time to think a little bit broader about what we're doing here. Still having the depth, but adding more breadth than we had before. And I think a lot of this starts also with and affects also the way our organizations look like. And that is what I want to do. Maybe some of you feel this being a little bit more provocative, but I think it's important now. Some sort of let's call it a call to action to the CIO, because with business workloads changing, with business applications changing, we need a modern and adequate organization here. And when I look at many of the discussions I see around access control and GRC for SAP and other environments, then many of these are because there are certain organizational silos. And I think it's time to think about breaking down silos. I think if we think in these silos, we better think in a business application and service silo holistically. Or we even think about which responsibilities should remain in IT and which should be shifted to the business organization, where IT is more a supportive organization as a pool of resources. I think it's worth to rethink how must the organization look like. And that is the job of the CIOs of today. Thank you.